Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Signpost Series webinar. Eddie Burgess is my name. I work with Teagasc with the Agricultural Catchments Programme. Those of you that are watching the Signpost webinar regularly will have come across me in the past. And I'd like to welcome today Laurence Shalloo, who's the head of the Animal and Grassland Research and Innovation Programme in Teagasc. Laurence is based in Moorepark. I have no idea how Laurence has put himself forward for today, because I'd say he's up to his tonsils in getting things ready. A few minutes ago, he was talking about marquees coming, and I was thinking it's probably a bit like Glastonbury down there at the moment. So, Laurence, I'd like to wish you the very best in your preparations for the open day in Moorepark next week. Those of you that aren't familiar, Moorepark have an open day every second year, and it's on next Wednesday, the 2nd of July, and I think I wouldn't be wrong in saying it's Teagasc's biggest public event, and it's a fabulous occasion, so I'd like to give it a plug. Well worth attending for all, not just those involved in the dairy sector. Laurence is talking today, giving us an update on sustainability work that's been done in Moorepark. And I think a lot of people probably are getting a little bit fed up with the word sustainability. It's very topical and has been for a number of years now. But I know when we listen to some of our colleagues, particularly from the Athenry-based research, they say that sustainability is like a three-legged stool. It's not just environmental issues. There's economic and social aspects to sustainability. Where are we all going to be in the social structure going forward? So I would expect, Laurence, the talk is going to be fairly broad, and I'm looking forward to hearing what work your colleagues are doing in the AGRIP programme. Helping me with questions today is Meabh O'Hagan. Meabh works as a Signpost Climate Advisor, and she's previously worked as an ASIP advisor, so she has a lot of experience in dealing with farmers in environmental issues from both water, gaseous emissions, and carbon sequestration. So Meabh, thanks very much for joining us. And before we go any further, I just have to say all this wouldn't happen without the input and help from Yvonne Marr, who's working away in the background. We're not going to see Yvonne today, but Yvonne, thanks very much for putting it together. Laurence, my introductions are over. I haven't said too much about you. I know your research in the background. I hope I'm not wrong in saying this, but I understand it's largely involved with agricultural systems research. And you're from County Clare, I think. And on that introduction, you're putting up your presentation, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Eddie, and thanks for that introduction. And I do apologize if I start talking about marquee placement in the middle of this, because that's where my head is at over the last couple of days. So yeah, so we're in the final, I suppose, few days now into the Moorepark Open Day, which will happen next Wednesday, kicking off at 8:30. So what I'm going to do today, Eddie, is talk a little bit about, and I'm not going to do it justice. I'm just going to give a small introduction to what will be on show on the day next Wednesday. So we're very much looking forward to welcoming people. So the theme for the Moorepark Open Day is innovating for the future, and the theme for this morning is sustainability. And Eddie, just to confirm, those slides are moving?
Everything is looking good from my side here, Laurence.
Okay, super. Yeah. Super. Thanks, Eddie. So I suppose and exactly like Eddie said, when we talk about sustainability, there's three pillars, and in effect, if we don't have a balance across these three pillars, we're not sustainable. So if we're economically sustainable but not environmentally sustainable, we're not sustainable. And if we're not economically sustainable and environmentally sustainable but not socially sustainable from a work-life balance or an animal welfare point of view, we're not sustainable. So it's the three legs of the stool. I'm going to touch on the three legs, but again, as I've said, on the day next Wednesday, there's going to be a huge lot more discussed on each of these aspects. And again, I'm not going to deal with each of these areas, but just to give you a flavour of in the environment, we generally talk about water quality, we talk about emissions, whether that's greenhouse gases or ammonia, we talk about biodiversity, and we talk about water use. And that's important, given water scarcity indexes and where we might look to in the future with climate change and how we might be impacted with that. The second area is obviously economics, and we talk about profitability and we talk about cost change. I'm going to put a little bit more emphasis on that today, around where the profit situation is and where the costs have gone over the last couple of years. And finally, then in terms of social sustainability, there's probably pretty topical issue out there now around succession, and that's an agriculture issue, but it's probably a economy-wide issue as well, in terms of an economy at full employment and what the opportunities are, and it's probably a sign of success across the overall economy perspective. But succession is an issue on all farms, and I suppose getting that work-life balance right, getting animal welfare right, are important. So I'm going to briefly touch on these three areas, but again, much more detail next Wednesday. So where to from here? And we talk a little bit about the economics to start with. So I suppose just to look at what has happened in the last, just go back 15 years. In 2025, milk quotas will have been removed with 10 years. And I suppose just to paint a picture of how dairy industry output has changed over that period of time. In the 07 to 09 period, which is what we use as a reference point, we can see that we produced about the industry produced about 4.9 billion litres with just over 1 million cows. Incidentally, when milk quotas came in, so we were in a milk quota regime, milk quotas came in 1984, we had 1.5 million cows. So cows numbers declined as productivity per cow increased. Protein and fat, the reason I put them up is because they're important in terms of how farmers are paid. We were at 3.8 and 3.33 in terms of fat and protein, and there was 266,000 tons of milk solids produced. 2015 milk quotas came off, and if we look at where we got to, or where the industry got to in 2024, it produced 8.4 billion litres of milk, roughly about 1.57 million cows. Huge productivity increases in fat and protein percentages. So, that's a sign of, I suppose, genetic progress and good grassland management. And milk solids, had increased quite significantly, maybe to the tune of about 90%. So significant growth in the dairy industry. And the reason for that growth is between 1984 and 2015, we had a milk quota regime, which capped milk output at a certain level. That came off in 2015, and there was pent-up capacity within the industry at that point. So, between 84 and 2015, there was no expansion in the industry as a whole. We look at then what has happened in terms of the diet and the diet of a dairy cow. So, what we can see here is the blue bars are grass utilized. So, how much grass is being harvested by the animals from the system. And in 2012, we were harvesting about 6.7 tons. That peaked in 21-22 at about 8.4 tons. But we can see in 23 and actually 24, it's starting to decline. So the amount that we're harvesting is declining, and that's driven by a reduction in growth that we've seen in 23 and 24. On top of that then, and that these are the inverse of each other, obviously, the proportion of bought in feed on a dry matter basis is increasing essentially. So the proportion is the more of the diet is coming from feed being brought into the system. Then if we look at family farm income, and this is, I've just updated this based on the National Farm Survey results came out this week, and they show the profitability or the family farm income, which is basically the return to owned land and labour. For dairy farms, or for all farms, we can see here over between 2012 and 2024 with a projection for 2025. And what we can see here is that, the graph to the left, you can see dairy farm, family farm income is higher than the other enterprises. And you can see that there is significant volatility from year to year. So 2023 was a particularly tough year where our family farm income was just under 50,000 euros. Big recovery in 2024 up to 108,000 euros. And the projection for 2025 is again increased family farm income. But the question often happens, we've had some movement from other enterprises into dairying, and the question often comes is, why did that happen? And I suppose when you look at the profitability or the family farm income returns, you can see that the dairy incomes are higher, and that's one of the reasons why we've had a movement. And again, back to the milk quota regime and the pent-up capacity that was in the system. But I suppose then if we look at how has family farm income on dairy farms performed relative to inflation and the consumer price index. And if we look at the consumer price index between 2012 and to 2020 or 2021, very little movement. We can see relatively small, pretty stable in terms of increases. Again, that is something that we all kind of got very used to in society, and I suppose that's why there was such a shock to the system when we saw the increases in consumer price index in over the period from 2021 up to where we are today. So, you know, up an increase of approximately 24%. So how does the family farm income on a dairy farm perform relative to that? So if we look at and just regress on the family farm income on a dairy farm relative to time, we can see that there's an increase of somewhere in the order of 3,800 euros of family farm income per year over the period 2012 to 2024-25. So a significant increase in family farm income over that period of time. And I suppose when you look back and take 2012 and 13 as a base, the family farm income in 2012 and 13 on a dairy farm was 58,000 euros. The inflation over the period up to 24 was 23.4. So just to keep ahead of inflation, family farm income would need to have increased by 1,200 euros per year. And we can see that it's increasing by 3,800 euros per year. So the reality here is that the real income on dairy farms has been increasing over the period 2012 to 2024. But, and it's important to say this, is that, you know, the dairy farmers are milking more cows. They're working, I suppose, longer hours to earn this income because they're managing more animals in their herd. So it's not like a static situation, but their real income has increased over that period of time. I suppose then if we draw attention to probably the one major concern we have when we look at where income and costs might go into the future, and I suppose this is costs of production per unit of product, so per litre of milk produced or per kilo of milk solids. And what we can see here, similar to the consumer price index, and I'll show you a slide in a second with the input price inflation, what we can see here is that there's a virtual static picture, some volatility over time, but a relatively static picture in cost of production between 2012 and 2020. So cost of production went up a little, they came down a little, but they're relatively stable over that period of time. Since 2020, we can see a pretty dramatic increase in cost of production, and that is something that we're pretty concerned about. Essentially, it's looking like a 50% increase in cost of production over that period of time. And again, we're talking about your war in Ukraine, probably COVID, all these things coming together, driving cost of production much higher. So it's something that is very much a focus point for us next Wednesday. How do we get control of costs again? How do we help farmers to take out costs out of their business? And I suppose when we look at the reasons and we stand back and look at the reasons, what we're basically saying here is if we look at the input price indices from the CSO, we can see that, again, relatively stable over the period 2008 up to 2020, and that dramatic increase from 2020 up to 2022. And what is reassuring is we're looking at a price decline again, or an indices decline relative to 2024. So the point here is that costs have increased dramatically, driven by inflation, but we should be able to see them costs come off again because that input price inflation is reducing. It appears that those costs are not dropping as dramatically as we would have liked them to drop at farm level. So that's something that we need to focus on at farm level. So what do we need to do at farm level to take some of the costs out to ensure that we can take, get back to a situation where we're, I suppose, in a better position if milk price was to drop going forward. So that's a big focus for us going forward. The second area I just want to touch on is the environment, and just want to talk a little bit about, what the numbers are, and I suppose where the overall picture is. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is carbon footprint, and I'm using a paper published by colleagues in New Zealand. So they published this paper in the Journal of Dairy Science in 2022, and it ranked countries based on their carbon footprint. And it has a whole range of different countries there, and it has Ireland in there at 105. The first thing I'd say is the reason I like this display or this graph is that it's really clear and easy to see how the numbers look, in terms of relative performance. You can see quite easily, different countries. So it's a nice way of displaying the numbers. However, I suppose from a, being able to, use it as a useful indicator of carbon footprint, there is issues with it. Some of those issues, for example, I take the Irish data. The Irish data in this paper is based on 2012. The New Zealand data is based on 2017, 18. So different years data. So that's kind of problematic because industries are at different stages of development. Some of the studies in this are data that's nationally representative. So what does that mean? It means that, like the National Farm Survey, our own data, basically it's a weighted population to represent the national, weighted sample to represent the population. So it's very representative of what's out there. So it gives you a clear picture of what the national numbers are. And some of these studies are there's nothing wrong with them, but they're not actually representative of the countries that they're I suppose showing the numbers for. And that's not a criticism of these studies. They were never designed for that. The third thing then is the allocation. So how we allocate between meat and milk is different. Where we draw the system boundary, whether it's, cradle to farm gate. So do we include all of the emissions associated with, for example, electricity production or the concentrate production that might be produced in South America or whatever. And again, there's slight differences across these studies. And also there's differences in maybe how the numbers are expressed. So I'm going to use this slide in a second again to show you where the direction of travel, but I suppose from a comparison point of view, it's slightly problematic. So I suppose just then updating these numbers with where Ireland is today, and that's the number we'll be talking about at the open day next week, when we bring our own data up to 2022, so our performance data with 2022, and we include the most recent enteric methane emission factors, which have been published in the Journal of Dairy Science and other journals. So what it's putting us, the Irish carbon footprint of milk at 0.88. Now, again, just the caveat here is some of these other countries have different years data. So I'm not saying that these other countries in this graph are representative of where they are today. I'm just taking the data from that New Zealand paper and I'm putting the most up-to-date Irish numbers in there. And it's putting Ireland at 0.88 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk. So that's just painting the picture of where our number is today. When we use other approaches, and this is the Gleam from the FAO, and they publish numbers on an ongoing basis. I think this data, it's slightly dated, some of this data. So I think this one is from 2015. This data, I think it was only published in the last couple of years, but the data is from 2015. And that put Ireland with a carbon footprint of 102. And in this graph, and this, I'm not saying this is the case all the time, but within this graph, it had Ireland with the lowest carbon footprint across the comparison countries. So just to point that this is a fairly strong, I suppose, robust approach to generating carbon footprint numbers. I suppose then the next step is where the industry is going. And what I'm putting in here is based on where we think our best technologies are and how far we can get. So, where we utilize 12 tons of grass, where we are using 150 kilos of chemical nitrogen, where we're using 100% protected urea, where we're using 100% low emission slurry spreading, where we're using less than a half a ton of low emissions concentrate, where we have 90% 6-week calving rate. If we were to use a slurry methane additive, and if we were to use a feed additive during the dry period, again, only during the dry period when animals are not lactating, because it's quite difficult to put an additive into a diet of a dairy cow when she's grazing, we think our carbon footprint can get to 0.63. So all of these technologies are based on what's been, I suppose, achieved from a research point of view. And we have really good farmers that are very close to these numbers as well. So there is huge potential here to make further progress in terms of reducing the carbon footprint. And farmers are on that journey. And I suppose it's really positive to see the numbers drop. Or see our best farmers hitting close to those numbers of 0.63. Obviously then when you have the early adopters pulling down the numbers, the overall average starts to reduce as well. This does not include carbon sequestration from mineral soils in these numbers. So I suppose then just to paint a picture then in terms of overall emissions and where that's going, and I put this up because it does paint a picture in terms of cattle numbers. So the first one here is dairy cows. So basically what we can see here is dairy cows relatively static up to 2010-11 and then an increase up to after that. So on the opposite side, we can see suckler cow numbers pretty static up to 2008-9 and starting to decline. And we can see those declines again based on CSO data. And at the same time, we can see overall cattle number increasing over the period up to probably 2016-17, where they peaked. And now we're seeing cattle numbers dropping. So what you're seeing here is overall cattle numbers declining. What does all that mean for emissions and different technologies? So this is the EPA agricultural emissions nationally. And we can see this is the most recent report that was published in the last probably in the last month, which shows the final situation and includes 2023. And you can see here is that our peak emissions occurred in 1998 from agriculture. You had the decline in emissions up to 2010-11. Then you had the growth, again, relaxation of milk quota up to 2020-2021, and then decline again. So where is the overall picture? Again, target is to reduce emissions by 25% relative to 2018 by 2030. And at present, we're looking at a 4.1% reduction relative to 2018. And that's where we are up to date based on EPA numbers. So what's the expectation for 2024 is a further reduction in emissions in 2024. And if I was a guessing person, I would expect that emissions will drop again in 2025 based on when you look at livestock numbers out there. So what we're saying here is we have a 4.1, or agriculture has a 4.1% reduction in emissions achieved relative to 2018. 24 will see a further reduction, I'd expect. And 25 numbers, livestock numbers are, there is, I suppose, significant livestock, transport out of the country happening, and cow numbers are continuing to decline. I suppose briefly touching on water quality then, and I'm not going to go into huge detail here. And just, I suppose, this is, again, a number of EPA reports put together. And what I've shown here is the river water quality from the EPA reports across different time periods. And I suppose just to point and, high, good, and unsatisfactory. And unsatisfactory is over 8 milligrams. So what we're seeing here is that in the 2014-16 period, about 38% of our rivers were in that category. That had increased significantly in the 2018-20 period. And we can see that declined significantly 19-21, 20-22, and held pretty stable over that period of time. So we did see an increase in 2018-20. And again, we're pretty clear now that was driven by a significant drought issue that we had in 2018. And potentially some of the management responses to that drought over that period in 2018. So I suppose the reason I put up this slide is that, did we see significant increases in nitrate concentrations in river water? Yes, we did in that 2018-20 period, driven by that drought in 2018, but it has declined again back to pretty much where it was. I suppose putting on top of that then, the most recent EPA report that came out and the early indicators report that came out earlier this year, and we're awaiting, I suppose, further reports, but just painting the picture from that early indicators in terms of nitrate. And that does seem to show a significant reduction in nitrate concentration in those 20 monitoring sites in 2024. So we further await the numbers from the EPA here, but again, 2024 looks like there's a significant reduction in nitrate concentration, which is to be welcomed and I suppose needs to be continued. And I suppose we'll have a major focus on water at the Moorepark 2025. And we'll talk very much about our Better Farming for Water campaign and the basically 8 actions for change. So very strong, and this has been, I suppose, talked about a lot within this forum here, but very much focused on nutrient management, land management, and farmyard management. And, you know, there's probably little bits that can be done on, you know, some farmers have probably very little to do, some farmers have more to do, but, you know, there's probably things to be done on all farms in this space. So I suppose, you know, to summarize on the water, progress has been made. And I suppose we need that to continue at farm level. And through these water quality campaigns, for example, the Better Farming for Water, there's going to be increased emphasis placed on water. The last slide I have on the environment is just on ammonia. And ammonia, just to make the point, is a really positive story. You know, ammonia reductions, we're seeing significant ammonia reductions since 2018. You know, and that's really positive because that's based on action at farm level, and ammonia is about 99.5% of it is coming from agriculture. So it's very much driven by agriculture. And what we're seeing is, you know, technology take up, whether that's low emission slurry spreading, whether it's fertilizer type, whether it's low crude protein concentrate, is happening at farm level. And that's having a significant impact on ammonia. So much so that, you know, the targets and the ceilings for ammonia are now being met. And that's something really positive. And we do need to celebrate these wins. We do need to, you know, call out when action at farm level is having significant impact in terms of meeting different criteria. So the last piece on sustainability is social. And I have 2 topics, and that's just in terms of calves, and then we're going to talk a little bit about labor, but just to make the point in terms of there's let's almost call it a revolution happening at farm level in terms of what's happening in terms of sex semen usage, beef genetics going on to dairy cows to increase the beef merit of the calves. So I suppose if we look at 2020, about 44% of the calves born from a dairy herd were beef, and that's increased to 54% in a 4-year period, and that will continue to grow. So that's having a significant impact on the beef merit of the calves coming from dairy herd. And what's driving that is the use of sex semen. So what we're seeing here is basically dairy farmers are using dairy sex, so female sexed semen, to breed dairy replacements. So that means that there is less need to reduce or to use dairy, so they can use less dairy, and then there's an opportunity to use more high beef merit AI on their dairy herd, and that's what they're doing. So it's really positive. There is I suppose some decline, and again, this will be talked at length at the open day. There is some decline in conception rates when we use sex semen, but locally, there's been a huge focus on fertility within the index, within the EBI over the last 25 years, which does create some space to have a slight decline in conception rates. It's one we have to watch on a continuous basis, but it's a real positive in terms of what can happen at farm level and what farmers are doing. The last piece I want to talk to, and I suppose this is probably the biggest issue we have out there in agriculture, and it's the age profile and the career attractiveness within dairy farms. And I suppose if we just look at some of the CSO stats and look at 2013, we had 8,200 farmers under 35, and that has dropped to 5,800, or 5.9% down to 4.3%. More worryingly, however, if we look at farmers over 65, that's gone from 27% in 2013 to 38% in 2033. So there is an issue, and there is loads of people being, I suppose, trained. There's agricultural trainers, there's lots of courses now in different universities, different colleges, Teagasc ag colleges, there's, private providers. So there's lots of things happening in this space. And I suppose the question is, are we training enough? Are we training these people the right way? Are we creating the career pathway opportunities that will allow these people to come into the industry? So one program that we're working on, just to put it out there, is the People in Dairy program. And there's 6 aspects to that, labor availability, labor efficiency. And that's, really about increasing work practices, making work practices more labor efficient, whether that's through technology or work practice. teaching farmers or helping farmers around human resource management, helping farmers with training, and also working with farmers in terms of progression and succession. And again, trying to help farmers go on the journey to become a more desirable workplace. And you know, there's lots of things we can do to reduce the labor demand in terms of technologies and practices, and that's something that we're working very strongly with farmers. And you know, when we look at farmers, you know, best farmers versus poorer farmers in terms of labor efficiency, there's, you know, and this just study shows very little differences in scale, significant differences in labor requirements per cow, differences in terms of start and finish time, differences in terms of length of the day, and differences in terms of non-productivity. And, you know, I think we need to call it out, you know, 70 hours a week versus 51, you know, how sustainable is 70 hours a week on a long-term basis? And, you know, I think any of us will say that it's probably, it's not sustainable in the long term. Yeah, we all have to work very hard at times, and particularly on a dairy farm in the spring, it's a pretty busy time. But, you know, on a continuous basis, even within a spring period, is that sustainable? And what do we need to do to make it more sustainable? So labor will be a very big focus on the open day. So just to finish up, Eddie, you know, I suppose when we look at the industry, you know, we look at it as, you know, profitable pasture-based systems, grazing systems, and milk production. So that's what we need. That's what gives us our edge. That's what gives us our competitive advantage. We need to meet the sustainability challenges. So we meet, you know, whether that's ammonia, whether it's greenhouse gases, whether it's water quality, whether it's biodiversity, we need to work together to meet those challenges. We need to create desirable and rewarding career pathways for people that are coming in, not just from people within the industry, but also from people that are maybe external to the industry, creating those pathways. And I suppose the final piece is producing a differentiated value-added product that would mean that we, you know, can get a higher milk price on a long-term basis. And I suppose they are what we need, and they are for me, the big components of an industry that is sustainable in the long term. So just to finish up, I just have a picture of our open day map and our open day route for the open day. And just to point, you know, there's lots of information online about how to get here. It's a free event. You don't have to register. Gates open at 8:30, open till 5 o'clock. All are welcome. It's family friendly. But just to, you know, talk, you know, it's very much focused on sustainability, and it's focused on innovation for increased sustainability. And it crosses all the different aspects from, you know, grassland to business to infrastructure to breeding and reproduction to dairy beef, animal health and welfare, working effectively or labor, the environment. There'll be industry partners available on the day. Ag tech will be available on the day. Our food research program will be discussed. Our Vistamil program will be discussed. And we also have a forum on industry, and I suppose the forum will very much focus on what's going to happen next, where to go to next, and what's the next step for the dairy industry in Ireland. So Eddie, I'll leave it at that and take any questions if there are some.
Laurence, thanks very much. Thanks very much for keeping the time, and you have an awful lot in there. And we have questions come in. I need to apologize. I've hosted a webinar before, and I keep on forgetting to ask people to use the chat function to ask input their questions. But there are questions coming in. But Laurence, just before we get to the ones that have come in, there are a couple of points there that really struck home with me, and I suppose I'm showing my lack of knowledge, and I'm putting my hands up. I think we have to admit where we don't see things. We all get working stuck in our own areas, and we tend not to look outside the box. But two figures there really struck me, and one was the increase in milk solids, going from 3 point something up to 6, almost doubled in not that long a period. Certainly well within the length of time that I've been working in Teagasc. I think it's a real figure, and it's a really significant change. Maybe just to on that.
Yeah,
sorry. And the second thing, just I'll hand over to you then. The other thing that I hadn't realised, and I think it has only just happened, is that we have met the ammonia emissions target. And I think that's incredibly significant, because a lot of other countries in Europe. I'm working with the Nitrates Directive. I work with the Catchments Programme, and I know the Nitrates Directive as a policy instrument is being used in other countries to target ammonia emissions.
Mm.
So I
So,
just
so I suppose, yeah,
start.
and deal with the ammonia one first, Eddie. So huge progress, and it's important that we celebrate this progress too, you know, and kind of call it out, because it's progress farmers have made. But it doesn't mean that we can take our foot off the pedal. So we have to continue to make that progress, whether it's through continued with the lower crude protein concentrate, whether it's continued using less, continued with that type of fertilizer, and there's always a risk, you know. If there was system change and we had more animals indoors, and if policy changes drove that change, and it meant that there was more animals placed indoors, like we see in the continent, then there's a really strong risk we go the wrong direction with ammonia, and that's a possibility, and that can be a side effect from a policy that could be implemented. That's the first thing. Just in terms of protein and fat percentage, and it is a really strong success story in terms of the fat and protein increases. And I suppose if you look at it, there's a number of different things. There's been a very strong focus on pasture, which is very helpful in terms of protein and fat. When the EBI was launched in 2022, the multiple component pricing system was built into the pricing of milk, which has, I suppose, increased the signal back to the farmer on the returns from better protein and fat percentages. So that has reflected in the numbers. Just one example is that the increase, the rate of increase in fat and protein now relative to maybe 10 years ago is about, the rate of increase is double. So farmers are reacting to the signals they're getting from their milk processors. Farmers are using the best genetics through the EBI, and they're generating significant returns. One stat, Eddie, just to be interested, that increase in fat and protein percentage alone over the last 10, 12 years is worth roughly 250 million a year on dairy farms.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's real.
It's real.
It's real, yeah. No, thanks for highlighting those. And I couldn't agree with you more, Laurence, in expressing that we have to highlight and celebrate the success stories. Too often with sustainability issues, people love to focus on the negative. The media naturally gravitates, always has and always will gravitate towards the bad story. That seems to be what sells, and they're in the business of selling papers and other advertising. So they're going to gravitate on that. But where we have success stories, I fully agree. And there are success stories out there. I'm not saying there are plenty of negatives, and we will hear of them, but where there are successes, we have to give credit where they have happened. And if we don't, we won't bring people with us when we're asking them to implement practice changes into the future. Maeve, I'm not able to multitask, so when I'm talking to Laurence, I'm not reading questions coming in on the chat function. So I'll have to tic-tac with you there. I'll let you ask a few and I'll have a look and come back.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, look at a couple of comments coming in, thanking you for the quality of your presentation and the information in it, Laurence. I suppose there was a couple of questions surrounding that that figure of the 0.63 of a carbon footprint. And I suppose I know that you had some of the information there, but if you could maybe just go through again, what is the assumed level of measure adoption or mitigation measure adoption in order to achieve that carbon footprint figure? And then just following on from that, then there is also a question regarding the emissions coming from concentrates and how whether the source of where those concentrates are coming from is going to affect that carbon footprint figure.
Excellent question. So just to be clear, right? So essentially that 0.63 is our blueprint, our roadmap for where dairy farmers need to go, with two caveats. The manure additive and the feed additive. So if we take the manure additive and the feed additive out of that calculation, it brings it up to 0.68 roughly. So it's a relatively small benefit. So what else? What other levels of technology adoption are we talking about? We're talking about 150 kilos of chemical nitrogen, 100% protected urea, so no can. We're talking about 100% low emission slurry spreading. We're talking about a calving rate of 90% in 6 weeks. We're talking about a grazing season length of about 260 to 270 days. We're talking about a stocking rate of roughly about 2.55 cows per hectare within the nitrates derogation limits. And we're talking about, that's what I presume that's pretty much all we. So, 90% of the diet is coming from, on a dry matter basis, coming from grass. Essentially what it is good technology practice at farm level is what's driving that change. With the two caveats, the feed additive, which is given a very small benefit because it's only during the dry period, and the manure additive, which is giving us maybe 0.03 of a gain. So take those two out and it's 0.68. And so that'll give you kind of a picture of where the numbers are coming from. That's the first question. The second one, Meabh, was
about the contribution
yes.
of meal. Yeah.
Yeah. So really good question. So, when we look at this week, we just published our AgNav, which is our digital sustainability tool for measuring sustainability for tillage, right? And at the moment, we didn't, I suppose, have a carbon footprint for tillage in Ireland up to very recently. So that's now there. So when we assume the concentrate that's fed at farm level, we use CSO data from its source, and there is huge potential, in my opinion, to reduce the carbon footprint of the concentrate that we're using at farm level. So there's two journeys we need to go on here. First thing is we need to reduce the level of concentrate we're using on dairy farms. So we're using about 1.35 tons. We need to reduce that dramatically to bring it back to a sustainable level. And the second thing is that the sourcing of that concentrate needs to be, I suppose, we need to be much more judicious on how we source that concentrate, because and Jonathan Hearn, my colleague, has modeled this out. We can halve the carbon footprint of the concentrate by being more sustainable about how we source it. And that's the journey we need to go on. We need to source more of it from Irish, obviously, because that's a very low carbon footprint. But that's not going to be possible for it all, because we're not going to have enough. But then we need to be very judicious around how we source our concentrate going into the dairy herd. And I suppose policy is going to help us here. UDR and how those borders are going to change is going to help us. And it's something I think that we all need to look at and embrace.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting being at the Tillage Open Day in Oak Park. Like, there was a huge appetite there among the tillage farmers for that AgNav figure to show the sustainability of Irish grain. So it'd be very helpful to have that. Just something else that struck me as well, especially working in the Signpost Advisory Programme, where we're kind of supporting farmers to adopt some of these measures, and how it links to like the first section of your presentation as well, is the vast majority, say maybe apart from the slurry additives and the feed additives, the other measures that you're talking through there to improve carbon footprint should all lend a hand to improving farm profitability as well.
Absolutely. And that's for me the really important part. So where we can get a win-win scenario and we can take farmers on the journey to increase profitability while increasing sustainability, it's going to put us in a really strong place.
Yeah.
I suppose the reality is the feed additive and the manure additive part of it will come in time, but we don't have the business model really to, there's going to be costs associated with those. And how do we get that business model in play that will incentivize a farmer to use more of those technologies? So that's why the focus is very much on the technologies that will increase profitability and reduce emissions, while maybe working on that business model and working on the new technologies. And there is a pipeline of new technologies that we're working on to reduce the emissions. Some are given more exciting results than others.
Yeah. I think there was a few questions there, Eddie, as well, around carbon sequestration, wasn't there?
There was. Sorry, Meabh. Yeah, I was lining those up to ask there, and
perfect.
I'm kind of just grouping them together, Laurence. There seems to be a lot of interest in carbon sequestration. One is the carbon footprint. Does carbon sequestration come in any way into the calculation of carbon footprint? And just very quickly put another one: who measures carbon sequestration and who claims the benefit from it?
Good question. So just in that 0.63 figure I talked about, there is no carbon sequestration put in there. The most recent data from, I suppose, Johnstown Castle and NASCO, the towers network. So we have a really strong network of towers being run by the team in Johnstown in terms of soil carbon. They're showing that, you know, if based on the data that's coming through, if that was to be representative across the country, that would bring our carbon footprint from potentially 0.63 down to 0.5. We don't include it in the numbers because we're waiting, I suppose. The reality is we're waiting for that data to come through in a much more robust fashion in terms of what's happening in the towers. And you know, I'm sure in this Signpost network, our program, our discussion, the sequestration stuff has come up before and it's been discussed before at NIN. So there's a whole team working on it. It's a relatively, it's an area of work that probably Teagasc is working on for years. But the growth in that team now is pretty big, and I think what we're really strongly saying that you know, give it another couple of years when that data is more in the system, we'll be very strong in terms of what the numbers are. So in terms of the other question is in terms of who owns that carbon sequestration, Eddie, is it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so I suppose that we you know. This is probably moving on to carbon farming, and this is going to be potentially an alternative income source for all farmers. And that whole debate is going to have to be had in terms of what's happening in terms of sequestration. But I suppose the important piece there, and one we need to probably differentiate, is you have baseline carbon sequestration on mineral soils, but then you have the additionality. So what's been done to increase the levels of sequestration. And in my head, both of them should be counted in terms of the overall numbers and the overall picture in terms of sequestration. So you have what's happening and what are we doing to increase the level of sequestration. And they're two separate things.
Thanks, Laurence. Meabh,
yeah, there was just a couple of questions there, I suppose, around like the social sustainability side of things, Laurence. Two questions there that I think could be slightly linked, I suppose. There was one there talking, wanting you to comment on the issue around land accessibility for young farmers and the barrier that presents to maybe encouraging young farmers to get involved. And then another question then actually around the percentage of dairy heifers that are now being contract reared, and I suppose that can kind of be connected maybe to land accessibility and nitrate stock and the pressure that can put on farmers as well.
Yeah, and like I suppose deal with the second one first. You know, there is increased levels of contract rearing, and I suppose that is land mobility in one sense. What you're doing is you're increasing the level of specialization. You're taking the heifers off, and you're using that land then from a to produce milk essentially. So and there is a cost, and the cost. It's important that we, I suppose, spell that out. There is a cost out of getting heifers reared, contract reared. And if you can use that land to produce milk, then there's an advantage out of doing that. If you don't, then there's a cost associated. And there's also, an increased specialization. So your contract rearer could be potentially a better rearer of heifers than you are yourself. So there's many advantages, but I suppose the one thing for me is that it's like any business arrangement. You need to watch it tightly. You need to ensure that there is that you're getting back what you want, and there's many of these relationships work very well. There's the odd one that doesn't, and I think it's important that they're managed. That's the first thing. Second thing, land availability, and land availability is an issue for some, absolutely. But I suppose for me, when I'm looking around and I'm looking at talking to dairy farmers, there's a much bigger challenge than land availability, and that's having people that have the skills, the training, the attitude, the business etiquette to take on some of these business opportunities that are there. For me, that's a much bigger issue than land. Yes, land availability is an issue as well, but having people with the right training, spent time with the best farmers, are really strong from a business point of view, really strong from a grassland point of view, really strong from an animal management point of view, and having those people, there will be many more opportunities than those people are available for. And that's the problem. So making sure that we have those people coming through the system, for me, is much bigger issue. So that they're able and willing, and probably even most importantly, that they themselves can decide and look at the best opportunities and see the best opportunities and can take on the best opportunities, and that they're able to distinguish the best opportunities from maybe the not so good opportunities. So having people with those skills is really, really important.
Yeah, that's perfect, Laurence. Thanks very much. It is a big issue, I suppose, like going forward, but maybe we need to think outside the box a little bit in terms of there's plenty of people with interest in farming and that, but yeah, maybe it's just creating some sort of way to link those people up with people who are looking for hands on the farm as well. So
yeah. Laurence, a lot of interest on the carbon emissions and that questions, and I'm conscious there are a few other topics in there, so maybe we might pick out one or two more in that area and then move on to the others. But interesting came in there. Will it be possible, to think, for farmers to get to net zero carbon emissions? And actually, just as my own personal comment, just looking at it, when you had the measures that were needed to get down to the 0.63, you had 150 kilograms of chemical nitrogen. I often get asked by farmers, why are we going with 150? Should we not be looking for 50 or even less? So I'll put those two together.
So I suppose for me, Eddie, yeah, absolutely. Chemical nitrogen, and I think we have to take it in the round. Moving to protected urea has about a quarter of the emissions when we compare it to CAN. So moving to protected urea for me is the most important step in terms of reducing the emissions from fertilizer. And then we reduce the level. And we're reducing the level because reducing nitrogen balance basically reduces the risk of nitrogen loss. So having less nitrogen in the system means there's less nitrogen to be lost through whatever pathway. So why don't we go with 50? And I suppose that's the big concern for me. Our big thing for me is we need balance and we need sustainability, and sustainability goes across the pathways. So if we just take about, the average response to a kilo of nitrogen is about 15 kilos of pasture. So that's what, from all our studies, that's what we're able to grow. We know that clover will give us about 1.5 tons extra grass. So I suppose if we drop to 50 or if we drop to zero nitrogen, there's nothing wrong with that, but we need to adjust our stocking rates accordingly. And the implications that's going to have from a financial point of view, etc., needs to be considered before you do that. The data is very clear. Clover will give us 1.5 tons. We absolutely need to embrace that. We need to absolutely have clover in the system. But then we reduce our chemical nitrogen, we will reduce our pasture production. We look across all our different studies, that's clear. So if we don't want to reduce stocking rate, or if we need to that chemical nitrogen. So I suppose basically, if we look at across our different studies, we can grow with clover and 150 kilos of nitrogen. We can grow as much as we can grow with the 212 or the 214 without clover. So that's why it's 50 or 50, that's why it's 150 kilos of chemical nitrogen. Second question, Eddie, was
can we reach net zero?
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah. So I suppose based on where technology is today, and based on where we are with additives, for example, that 0.63 or 0.5. Let's call that 0.5 because we're talking about net zero from a carbon point of view. That's where I'd say the technology is today. But there is, as I kind of alluded to earlier, there is huge work going on in different areas, whether it's through on nitrous oxide, whether it's on CO2, whether it's on methane. And will technology in 2 years' time give us more in terms of what we can reduce? I would be very confident that it can. And the question then is, that's, going to net zero. I don't know what the question relative to GWP 100 or some other GWP. But I suppose, when we get, technology is today based on what I painted in front of you, potentially can bring us to 0.5. And then we talk about offsetting, whether that's through forestry or whatever you'd need to bring it down further, right? That's the first thing. But I suppose when we look at the different reports and look at, whether we're talking about temperature neutrality, versus net zero. They're different things, and the need to reduce different components of emissions is different depending on what we're talking about. So I suppose really what I'm trying to say here is the devil is in the detail around some of this stuff.
Yeah. Sorry, Meabh, I think I'm going to try and move it on, but just a lot of your comments and a lot of the questions come in here, and I'm probably going to direct this towards Meabh. I think a lot of the difficulties in trying to adopt practice changes that in measuring these things, you're talking about different methods of GWP, GWP 100, GWP star, climate impact versus the CO2 equivalent figure for fat and protein corrected milk. There's so many different metrics, and the targets and way they're measured change. And gaseous emissions are not something that's tangible. You don't go out and see it. And I think, Meabh, from your point of view, trying to engage farmers with it, I wonder, I always think that these factors, the changing ways of it being measured, maybe changing goalposts, and the fact that it's not something that's tangible or easily seen makes it a very difficult topic to try and get practice change implemented to take it on. I don't know, have you a quick comment on that?
Yeah, definitely. It has come up before, especially around kind of the methane measurement. It is a comment that we would get quite commonly. But I suppose what I kind of say to that is, yeah, it's an important issue. It's great when we can get more accurate data to kind of back up the calculations and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it doesn't actually change our target. It changes our baseline, but it doesn't change the fact that we still have to achieve a 25% reduction on our 2018 figures. So if our current methane figures were to be reduced, so too would our baseline of 2018. So it still leaves us in a similar position where we need to achieve that 25% reduction. So that's the first thing. And the second thing I would say is, especially to farmers, is yeah, even though you might say, well, these measures, are they relevant if the things is going to change? There's none of the measures, as Laurence kind of talked through, like the likes of the improving grassland utilization and, protected urea and better use of our nitrogen and improving our nitrogen efficiency. All of those things benefit profit anyway. So even if our baseline changes and the goalposts are moved and stuff like that, these are measures that we should be adopting on the farm, even just purely from an efficiency and profitability point of view. And then we also have the other benefit of that they're more environmentally sustainable. So I think, regardless of if the baseline changes or not, if we're GWP star or GWP 100, the main points remain the same. We should be adopting these measures on farm regardless.
Very well answered, Meabh. I hope you didn't mind me putting you
no
there. That I shouldn't have done. I'm going to make a slight change of tack because we're very nearly out of time. But just quickly before we go, there's a question came in there. Is there any biodiversity measurement for environmental sustainability apart from the proxy for water quality? And that question really caught my attention because I was speaking at two farm walk events earlier this week. Tirlawn had an event near Ballyraggett on Seamus Brennan's farm, and on the way driving into it, there was a protest sign put up, and it said dairy expansion equals green deserts. And on the following day, I was down in Doon in Limerick, and Martin Crowe won an award with the Teagasc Sustainability competition last year, and we did an excellent farm walk there, focusing on water quality. But a comment that I have from both farms, as you look across the country, and both of them are highly productive, efficient dairy farms doing all these measures that you've been discussing, is if you were to look across the countryside, it was anything but a green desert. The hedgerow diversity and density of hedgerows and small field size was exemplary, and both farms very sustainable economically. And it was a comment that I think I really have to stress, that large fields and wire fencing does not have to be synonymous with expansion in the dairy sector. But just, sorry, Laurence, to come back to you with the open day coming up next Wednesday. Is there aspects of biodiversity being discussed, and that's sustainable?
Absolutely, it's a huge program it's a huge program here in Moorepark. The exact stat, I think we have between maybe 5 kilometers of hedgerow put in here in the last 4 or 5 years, and it's absolutely amazing to see how much it has grown. And it looks really well. So biodiversity is a major focus area for us next week. And Eddie, just to go back to your point there, I would say that's, maybe those comments that you had got and whatever, that's really old school stuff. I think, the dairy farmers have moved on, and biodiversity is a major part of their business now. And biodiversity and investment in biodiversity and hedgerows and all that is something that dairy farmers are very much into now. And you'll see plenty of it in Moorepark, and there's a whole focus area on biodiversity. Just one example, in the last 2 years, we've put in a Woodlands for Water habitat area, and it's about 3 hectares down near the river, and it's, I suppose, multi-purpose in terms of reducing sediment loss, in terms of overland flow, whatever. And so we're pretty excited about some of the stuff that we're doing in this space.
Grand, Laurence. Apologies to people. I meant to be looking after time here, and I'm looking at 10:32. I'm going a little bit over time. I see a few people saying goodbye and clocking off. Laurence, thank you very much for a very comprehensive and broad talk. I wish you the best of luck in getting everything organised and set up for next Wednesday, and best of luck on the day. I look forward to seeing you there. It's always a great day. And before we go, just to say, next week we have Richie Hackett and Bridget Lynch giving a talk on the research that Teagasc are undertaking with catch crops. And I suppose this is a good follow-on from the successful open day that they had at Oak Park a couple of days ago. Thanks very much to our audience for coming, and to everyone else that has given a hand in putting this together. And I wish you all the best. Take care.